With no further ado, I'm going to get us started on our panels. Our first panel is called Rethinking Readiness, Measuring Essential Competencies in the AI Era. And I think this builds nicely on the points Dan was making and Amit was making. So the panel will be moderated by my colleague on the Board of Trustees at ETS and also the CEO of the United Way of Southeastern Michigan, Darian Hudson. So welcome, Darian, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Okay, so if everyone's gonna come on up, we're gonna start diving right in to rethinking readiness and measuring essential competencies for the AI era. This will continue the theme of muscular conversations. Our team is going to be flexing their muscles on readiness in this concept of what we are actually trying to prepare our learners for. So as AI is rapidly reshaping our landscape around education and work and daily life, we know that our students and our learners of all ages are going to have a different set of skills. And this is happening very quickly. The McKinsey Future of Work report, many of you I'm sure are familiar with, is telling us that just in 4 years now, 30% of the jobs are going to actually be automated. And we know that this is being accelerated by generative AI. So we have a panel of experts this morning who are going to help us address these questions. What does this mean for us? And how do we make sure that our learners are truly ready? So I'm pleased to introduce to you first Sarah Caldwell. She's the Global Head of Readiness of OpenAI, and she's focusing on skills and competencies for an AI-enabled world. We also have Victor Lee, who is researching, he is the associate professor at Stanford, and he's the faculty lead for the Stanford Accelerator for Learning Initiative on AI and Education. And he is studying learning and technology and assessment. And last, we have Jessie Sparks, who is from our ETS Research Institute. She is the director of research with deep expertise in measurement and assessment science. So we're going to dive right in, and I'll let you all tell a little bit more about yourselves as we answer this first question. But the key here is when we talk about readiness in the AI era, what feels fundamentally different from even 3 or 5 years ago?
Sure. I can start. Hi again, I'm Sarah. I'm also LDT 2019, so yay, yeah. I nearly got lost coming around the corner. I hadn't seen this building before. It was very exciting. And thank you so much to ETS. OpenAI and ETS are partnering right now on an initiative around OpenAI Certified, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. But thank you so much for having me. The question is around sort of what's changed in the last 3 to 5 years around this conversation. And I was reflecting this morning, 3 years ago, ChatGPT didn't exist. So 3 to 5 years is actually sort of an eon when you think about the pace of change. But the most fundamental change around this readiness question, in my opinion, is 3 years ago, we were having a lot of conversation about sort of wholesale job displacement, which entire jobs were going to be replaced. And the conversation we have now is much more around a task level. So thinking about jobs as an associate, an amalgam of tasks, the displacement is actually happening much more at the task than at the job level. So if you think about an engineer, or you think about coding, it's much less about, oh, an engineer won't exist, but what aspects of that role are going to be fundamentally changed, and how does that shift sort of the window that we consider when we look at a role. I was also reflecting, I was here in 2019 and thinking about the conversations we were having only, 7 years ago. And the biggest changes from that perspective, one is just the speed. As I mentioned, I think this is going at an exponential rate that is hard at times to reason about. And the other is just access to the tools. I think about how challenging it was to get access to an LLM in 2019, to use machine learning against a learning problem. And now with the advent of this technology and with chat and things like that, just the amount of access and the sort of democratization of access is so different. So I think thinking about jobs again on a task level, but then against the backdrop of the speed and accessibility that's just so different than it was a couple years ago.
So Victor, thank you, Sarah. Victor, can you help us understand this from a learning science perspective? What has changed?
Well, from the learning sciences, there's a lot of talk about tools and people and the nature of work. And I think that fundamentally what we're looking at here is a serious introspection as to what is our relationship to the work with respect to the tool, and what is sort of the distinctive value that we bring to the activities and tasks that we complete and perform. We've always seen work as something that is a labor that we put in, and tools are there to help us, and we would, help us get incrementally along on some of that labor. But now we're seeing that that has been really disrupted, and that labor can just be done almost instantaneously. And because we've put so much stock in our value and in our capabilities to do that work, that's requiring us to think more about, like, what is the unit of analysis, what is the work, what does it mean for us to interface with that tool, and how should we feel about that work, how should we feel the pride of a job well done, how should we feel about a product that we help design and create. So I think that there's a lot of questions here about, like, how do we relate to the kinds of tools that are available, and then how do we feel about ourselves in relation to that work, given all of the effort we put in to prepare to work with those tools.
Thank you. So, Jesse, a little bit of a different question. Why is measurement such a critical lever in this moment? As we're talking about change, how do we assess what's working and what isn't? And what happens if we fail to use measurement?
Yeah, thank you, Darian. I think that, measurement is so important, especially when we think about the emergence of AI tools. We have essentially a new construct emerging of AI literacy. And so we certainly need good assessments, good measurements of this emerging competency, which requires clear definitions about what do we mean when we talk about AI literacy, what does that entail, and then how do we design assessments that are tailored to our understanding of that construct. And thinking, of Dan's talk this morning, maybe multiple choice assessments are not adequate to capture the range of knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes that we mean when we say AI literacy. So that requires us to really rethink how we do assessment, and to really think about putting people in situations that are able to test their application of AI, their interaction with AI, their ability to collaborate with AI, and to critique the outputs that they're getting from those systems and be able to use them to meet their needs. Right. So I think one other thing that's sort of interesting to think about in terms of where we are in this moment, we do a lot of work at ETS around personalization. I'm the director of our line of work on personalized assessment. And so one thing that's really an opportunity is that, the widespread use of generative AI is making personalization more accessible. In the past, it would take quite a lot of effort to really personalize an assessment to meet all the needs of all the students in a classroom. Like, let's just think about that small context. And now, with the aid of these tools, teachers can even take that into their hands, and they can, make variations of the assessment. They can more readily personalize to the needs of their students. And that's going to open up more access for more individuals. And that's really important, because that's one of the things that measurement should do, is really should enable opportunity for more students at any age.
Yes, please, Victor.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. Jesse mentioned about the importance of AI literacy, where I think there's something in the water where we kind of agree that that's one of the sets of essential competencies for the AI era. But I also want to amplify, we don't really have a clear articulation of what that is. It's one of my research areas. I'm involved in some of the framework developments around there. But to be perfectly frank, assessment is the tail that wags the dog here. We need to put our efforts into developing the assessments and identifying the constructs and putting those embodiments out there. And that is going to do a huge amount for the field. But that takes a lot of work. And there's also a lot of thought in, like, the nature of the assessment, and then what are the, assumed preconditions for being able to be successful in that. So, while we'll talk about AI literacy a lot, and I have a sort of love-hate relationship with the term because it wraps up so many things that I care about, but I also think that when you try to get down to precise definitions, it's very elusive. That this is something that is highly relevant to think about, and to put our heads together and try to actually make some artifacts, some assessment tools, techniques, and practices that can help us gain clarity on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned working with Jessie and her team, as well as we've sort of entered into this space from the lab's perspective, is just how important measurement is as a communication tool. So as we've been thinking about how an employee can communicate their set of AI skills and learnings to their employer, actually having some clear measurement guidelines and some clear assessments is such a key tool, because otherwise you fall back on proxies that may be a bad fit or out of date. And so a lot of the conversation that we've been having with ETS is really thinking about, obviously, these assessments and what we define as AI literacy is not value neutral. It will communicate what we think is most important. But then if we really nail this well, we've created a new type of communication tool where people can talk about what they're great at and communicate that more clearly in an objective framework. So that's one of the things I've been most excited about working with ETS, is really just thinking about measurement, not just for its own sake, but as a communication tool in this sort of new era when we don't have shared definitions yet.
And I think assessment can really help us create those shared definitions, right? To build an assessment, you do need very concrete definitions of what you mean when you talk about this construct. You need to define it in ways that an assessment developer can build items, tasks, scenarios, interactive tools around that. So I think, to your point, assessment really will help us nail down what we mean. It will give us a way to talk about it publicly, and it can be a lever for educational policy as well. If we know that there are assessments that are widely used, that's an incentive for schools, education systems to really put effort, investment, et cetera, into education around AI literacy, and not just for students, but for their teachers as well, who need to be really equipped to support their learners in developing these skills for the new era.
So let's go a little deeper around the core competencies that we feel are needed at this time, and how do we prioritize them? We're talking a lot about AI literacy, but we know there are others. We've heard problem solving a lot, critical thinking, creativity, and I know that's a rub for some of you. So I'm very curious, what are some of these other core competencies, and what's the most urgent to measure at this time?
Well, I'll speak to critical thinking because oftentimes when you press people on what do we need people to be able to do in the AI era, and like what do we need to really foster in our higher education and our K-12 education, they say critical thinking. And then, the response to that is, what is critical thinking? Like, how do you know it when you see it? And, from the perspective of cognitive science and the perspective of education and learning sciences, it is also not a well-defined term at all. So, for example, I'm probably really good at critical thinking when it comes to educational theory and learning design, but I'm not good at critical thinking when it comes to mushroom foraging. And I think it's illustrative. I'm not hallucinating this, right? But I think it's illustrative because, what does mushroom foraging require? A lot of content knowledge, a lot of situational knowledge that I don't necessarily have. And so just to say, oh, we have a generally good critical thinker is not a really sensible direction to go. There's a context, and practice specific set of things to that. And so when we ask, what is it with critical thinking? Is it looking at that big depth of knowledge and synthesizing? Is it discernment? Is it identification? And so I think that that's also something really important for the work in assessment and learning sciences and the folks here to unpack and help provide guidance.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think, a lot of folks really want this idea of this domain general kind of assessment, these domain general claims, but we know that knowledge is inherently domain specific and contextualized. As a fellow learning scientist, we're on the same page about that. And so too should our assessments be contextualized. And I think that is one of the reasons personalization is so valuable, right? How do we take the assessment, maybe a template, a shell, a structure, and then really contextualize that to the domains of application that individuals are really going to be trying to apply those skills in. So that's, I think, a really powerful direction that we can take assessment, given that we have better tools to enable us to do that type of personalization at scale.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're still trying to, of course, at OpenAI and in our partnership with ETS, still trying to figure out what competencies we think are most important to measure. And there's sort of two classes. I focus mostly on AI in the workplace, and so thinking about employees using AI in job-specific contexts. And there's sort of two domain areas that feel like they're sort of emerging out of the fog. The first is around the ability to work and orchestrate a set of agents. And so being able to think about long horizon tasks, and that's essentially just systems thinking. So, can you decompose a very complex task into requisite parts? And then can you clearly communicate that to a system? And so we see people who, we would call AI literate or very able to use these tools to get great outcomes. One of them is, are you sort of a systems thinker? And again, that's a very general term, but can you basically take a bunch of complex work, decompose that into tasks, and then clearly communicate that to a system? You become extremely effective at working with the systems if you have sort of that core set. The other is sort of an understanding of in this case, the enterprise environment. So it used to be the case that execution or actually getting work done was extremely expensive. Probably one of the most limiting factors in an enterprise is just how many people do you have that you can throw at a task. It's becoming increasingly cheap. So, who are the experts within your organization who, one, have domain expertise, like deep domain expertise, to think really broadly? If execution is basically limitless, how can we go solve this problem in a new and novel way? And you need to have really deep domain expertise. You need to know your subject. To get kind of niche, there was a lot of conversation like a year or two ago about whether these like AI wrapper products would have legs in the market. And I think what AI wrappers got right was that they said, actually, we're going to take this LLM and imbue it with a ton of context about a specific domain. And that is really, really valuable. So there's working with agents orchestrating, which is maybe systems thinking. And then there's being able to actually have deep domain knowledge and then apply that to a system within an enterprise context. So those are things that are kind of starting to emerge when we talk about people who are really fluent, or when I observe people who are really, really good at working with our tools. It's usually one of those two things. And then if you have both, if you're someone who deeply understands your domain and sort of has that systems thinking, your sort of 1 + 1 is 3 with the tools.
Follow up on the systems thinking. It's just something that occurred to me as you're speaking. The way you described it was sort of a problem analysis, a way to decompose and to specify sorts of steps and processes. And there's certainly a family resemblance to the whole movement around computational thinking. And I think that's maybe a good pulse check for us. We are allured. There's an attraction to these new shiny objects, and where can we build on some of the work that we put in earlier? But then also, where are there important continuities and other core emphasis areas that we want to build strong overlaps with? And with that, it is thinking about the different contexts or other complementary or synergistic practices that we need to think about in the assessment designs. If we just think about AI literacy in isolation, we're probably barking up the wrong tree. But we think about AI literacy as it involves or draws upon sort of the competencies that are associated with computational thinking that may open some other doors and make us think about assessments in other ways too.
So this is perhaps maybe a simpler question than where we're going, but this is more of a curiosity. So a lot of times people interchange digital literacy with AI literacy. And so just curious to get your thoughts around that. Go ahead. I see you, Jesse. Go for it.
Thank you. Yes, so we have thought a lot about that. So I am a literacy person. I am a digital literacy person. So I come to this new emerging area of AI literacy from that perspective. And it's certainly more of a continuity than a whole brand new shiny thing. Certainly, these digital literacy skills, like evaluating the accuracy of information, understanding its provenance, knowing who's putting that message out and why, who benefits from this messaging, that is certainly more important in the current AI era as we see these tools being used to mislead people, deep fakes, fraud, You can name a number of examples. And so, we're not replacing digital literacy with AI literacy. I think it is highly grounded in these foundational skills of not just digital literacy, interacting with various media, but your foundational literacy skills as well, right? Can you read? Can you comprehend what's being put in front of you? It's even more important today.
So, oh, please, Victor,
Well,
go
one
ahead.
thing that, as full disclosure, Jesse is part of a team editing a handbook coming out this year on digital literacies, which is going to be highly invaluable. I've seen the preview of the contents, and then also as full disclosure, I'm co-authoring the chapter on AI literacy in that handbook,
Which
But
is
I-
very good, and that will be impactful too.
because it's in a great volume. But what I put in here is where I do have a discomfort, though, with literacy is I do think, in general, I don't think this is from necessarily the academic side, but it's just the general public uptake, is literacy is used very gratuitously as a term, where it's like, oh, digital literacy, media literacy, information literacy, financial literacy, health literacy, AI literacy. And so I think we have to
Data literacy.
data literacy. And so I think we need to be really careful about, how freely we throw the term out and really articulating what it is that we're hoping to see as a result of that. And then to think where the continuities are and like what's the cost benefit besides a snappy new term in there. Does AI literacy have important continuities with what has been developed in digital literacy? I think likely, but we want to make sure we're fully engaging with the thought that's in there before we just add yet another literacy to all of the literacies.
Just to follow up on that, a key aspect of literacy that I think is really central for us, from our perspective, is sense making, right? There's a reasoning aspect there. So it's not just, oh, there's text, so it's literacy, but it's really the deep processes of making meaning from what you're interacting with. And I do think that that really is important when interacting with LLMs and other AI tools.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're the ones making the meaning.
So, as our learners begin to adapt with this evolution of the tools and assessments that are available to them, how do we measure this concept of adaptability? And I would love to hear how it is applied, not only in education, but also in the workplace.
I guess I can start. So, adaptability, I think, is going to, be a continually more important sort of construct. How do people sort of cope with the situations that they're faced with as it is inherently dynamic, changing, evolving? You can imagine by the time that we create an AI literacy assessment that's built around a particular tool, oh, maybe that tool's not even in use anymore, or maybe in different ways. So trying to keep ahead of the changing pace of things is really quite tricky. So adaptability is going to be ever more important. And so I think that speaks to a need for not just static snapshot assessments that take the temperature of how people are doing at a given point in time, but actually confront them with situations where the information, the context, the parameters, the constraints are changing. And we can do that with a technique that we call scenario-based assessment that really puts test takers into a particular scenario, goal, and task context. And we use often simulated peers and other associates, so other virtual agents, essentially to interact with you and put you in a simulated social context where you're working with those characters toward that goal. And what we can do is really structure the assessment in a way that information is introduced at key moments or problematized for the test taker, and that can sort of push that opportunity for adaptability to show itself. So how do you take this new information and then apply it to a new context or a new situation, or someone's introduced a little wrinkle there? And so how do you cope with that? So that's, a technique that we have been developing and using, and we're using it now for AI literacy assessment to try to get at that to some degree. You can think about, persistence and resilience as other qualities that we would want to look for in students. And we've done some work on that. So we actually have a review paper sort of to this point about like common terms. There's no consensus in the field of what persistence means. There's not consensus of what resilience means. But we've tried to do a synthesis of the literature and try to put forward some proposed definitions that will work for people trying to think about what do these qualities look like as individuals interact with technology-based environments and so on. So how can we really try to measure those qualities? How do we foster them in students? Because we know that they will continue to be important as they move forward. So we are deeply thinking about ways to tackle these issues, but it is a tricky problem.
And I would stress the importance of scenario-based assessment and thinking about problems within context or in more authentic-looking tasks. So with Kristen Blair, who I think I saw here, and Joba Adisa, we've been doing some initial work looking at what exists currently in the published academic literature on like AI literacy assessments. And by and large, it's self-report.
Yeah.
And it says things like, I know what a wrapper is, or, I know what the letters LLM stand for. And it's like, what is the importance of that knowledge? Is that knowledge in use? And can we do better? And like the assessments that do exist, which are still in very early stages, creep more towards actually scenario-like things. But I think we have so much more to do, and that really needs to be a priority investment right now.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly don't have an answer, but can share an example of just sort of how complex this can be. So one of my first roles at OpenAI was actually focusing on how we train our internal employees on our technology. And you might think that if you work at OpenAI, you're just absorbing all of this information and able to keep up better than the average person. That's not always true. It's moving so fast that we have to develop an internal practice that's really rigorous about how we help people at the company understand the changes in the technology. And so I was working at OpenAI when we released our first reasoning model. And if you just look at the sort of outset or you look at the blog post, a reasoning model doesn't look terribly different from the prior GPT models. And to actually understand why a reasoning model is such a paradigm shift than a traditional GPT model, you actually have to understand some of the fundamentals around how LLMs are trained. And it was this realization for me that trying to teach people terminology or some of the like traditional vocabulary or some of the sort of knowledge statements was not going to be sufficient to help people make sense of the changes. And so it was this big step back for me about how to help people understand what a reasoning model was and how just explaining how these things are different was not fundamentally going to help them reason about what was next and next and next, which is really what we're trying to help people understand, is not just here's the change that has happened and how to adapt to it, but how can you think about, given all of the change, how can you start to look around the corner a little bit about what might come next? And that feels like such an important sort of skill of can you not just understand what's happening today, but can you use that to draw inferences of what may happen in the future?
So to dig a little deeper into, let's say, how this is actually happening in real time, how this is rolling out, what are some of the technical barriers that we need to be thinking about as we're trying to measure these competencies and actually how we're trying to define them? What are you all experiencing in the worlds from where you sit?
When we first started talking about doing a certification at OpenAI, the immediate reaction, even internally, was like, how on earth are you going to keep that up to date? It will be, painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You'll just have to constantly be keeping it up to date, which is the case. But there was this immediate reaction of like impossible to assess because it's moving so quickly. And so I think that is one of the challenges and one of the amazing sort of opportunities of wading into this space is thinking about actually creating this definition of what good looks like that feels a little bit more durable and doesn't change like every time a new model comes out. So that's really hard work. But I think that the first stumbling block that we ran into was, okay, well, how are we even going to know what good is in an environment that you're getting new information sort of every day in this generative way?
I would speak not to the technical barriers, but I think there's more social ones to really think about in here. The potential for really powerful, stealth analytics-based assessments and, privacy concerns with digital interactions, especially with young people. The ways in which assessment is viewed and treated by educators and how they would relate to it and their willingness. Like there's a bit of assessment fatigue throughout the world right now, even though, I think for people who've engaged with assessment for a long time, there's so much power and benefit that can come with it. But, we could try to get through those technical barriers that Sarah identified, definitely important ones. But if we don't do more to also think about the social landscape that this is playing out in, we have, I think, an uphill battle with that. Is my assessment data going to be used anywhere else? What, aspects of my interactions are we going to draw on for the assessment? How high stakes is this assessment going to be? Who will see the results of the assessment? How reliable and how much should I, instill a strong claim on what a particular measure had said at a given time and how to think about that? So I think those are going to be equally important social complexities to address in addition to the technical ones.
Yeah, just to build on what you said, I completely agree with everything that you've just said. And I think, one hope is that things like this stealth assessment sort of model where you are sort of continually extracting signal out of students' everyday learning interactions, that should, in theory, help with this assessment fatigue problem, because assessment will become less of a discrete event that you sit down to do, and it's more of just the ongoing sort of formative learning process. Of course, it brings along with it all the concerns about privacy, data use, and data misuse as well, and concerns about having the sort of technical infrastructure to keep that data over time as learners move through the educational system. Right now, these systems are so decentralized, it's basically impossible to track data from a single learner across these different educational settings. But that is sort of a long-term vision for trying to do learner modeling that's persistent, that tracks individuals as they grow over time, that uses multiple sources of data about not just what they do in school, but what they do out of school, to try to really understand who they are, what their capabilities are. But there's, a lot of technical challenges to really achieve that vision. And I think if you want to know more, Lydia's here somewhere and she's working on solving that problem.
Thanks, Lydia.
Thank you so much. So what does strong, I could say what does strong communication look like, but this is really a relationship that we want people to have with AI systems. So what does an effective or strong or even a healthy relationship look like with people and AI systems?
I'll start. I think it's one that the AI system is augmenting what the human is doing rather than supplanting it. We don't want to cede our agency to these technical systems. We want to keep our humanity. We want to be able to still have the capabilities that allow us to function in the world as human beings, and communication, relationality is so central to that. And so we cannot lose that. That is very high stakes. So how do we interact with these tools in a way that really enhances the strengths that we're bringing to the situation and enables us to actually use that brain power to do the higher order things? So let's use the tool to do things that maybe are tedious and that we shouldn't probably be spending our brain power doing, to free up those resources to really do that deep critical thinking, however we define it. But I think that's a key thing. How do we retain our humanity and not cede that agency and say, oh, the LLM will solve it for me, or the LLM will be my boyfriend, and I don't need to actually interact with other humans in the world, which, I think we've all heard news stories of this type of thing, and it's really troubling. So I think that's a key thing. How do you keep that humanity and, interact with it in the ways that you need to, but be able to know, there are some tasks that the LLM will not solve for you and you have to do for yourself.
Thank you.
I'll point out my esteemed colleague Roy P., who's sitting in the front here, forwarded something recently about the distinction that we need to start drawing or considering in our relationship with technology between outsourcing our work versus offloading. And to think about why we make those choices and what is sensible. And, I think there's, in general, a preference that we try to use these tools to offload and be able to accomplish the work that we want to do in more strategic and efficient ways. But, there could be some cases where we think about when and where outsourcing the labor is truly appropriate, but it has to be done with precision. And I think that just not treating our relationship with AI, whether it's with our AI girlfriends or boyfriends, or if it's with the work that we do, orchestrating multiple agents in our job, that we recognize the nuances that these situations require, and we don't make a blanket statement of how AI and different systems are supposed to interface with us.
Yeah, that makes me think about the role of friction in learning and how the difference between, I think you said offloading and augmenting.
Outsourcing.
Outsourcing. So what are you doing where you are sort of trying to create a friction-free environment or day for yourself versus how can you use AI in certain instances to introduce good friction? The AI systems are more capable across so many domains than the average human at this point, which means that for you to learn something or to push yourself into somewhere where you might be uncomfortable in order to learn something, you actually have the capability with you to be able to do that. So there's a lot of talk about non-technical coding and people being able to go in and actually develop and learn to code or learn to build apps without needing to have deep programming language. I was building an app last week. I'm not very good at it. It's extremely uncomfortable to do things for the first time. And now we have this system that, especially if you know how to engage with it and communicate the right context, can actually really push you out of your comfort zone. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, zone of proximal development. How can you spend more time in that zone? But rather than thinking of it as something that can remove all friction from your day, where it can actually inject quite a bit of friction that you might otherwise avoid because you sort of have this structured partner to engage in that conversation with.
Yeah, I love that you introduced the idea of friction. It comes back to like the classic work on desirable difficulties, right? We know that's where learning happens. And so the goal is not to just make your life 100% easy, but really give you the space to interact with the things, put effort toward the things that are going to support that learning.
So we're going to pivot a little bit to talk about lifelong learning and equitable systems. I live in the state of Michigan. Our governor has declared something. It's an initiative that's called 60 by 30, and essentially trying to make sure that 60% of our state or people in our state have some type of a post-secondary credential and some type of or a college degree. And right now, the question is, what are we actually getting our learners ready for? And we're pushing them to get these credentials, but how do we make sure that this isn't just one moment in time, that we're doing this just to graduate or just because this is where I'm supposed to go next, but that this concept of lifelong learning is really enabled because of AI?
Yeah, the OpenAI certified project is starting with AI literacy because that's where we feel that we can contribute as a lab. We have subject matter expertise in that concept, and so that's where we want to start. But one of the hopes with the reason we're doing a certification project at all is not to have a one-time you are OpenAI certified and therefore X. It's actually to help that create sort of a trust fabric for a larger jobs effort. So as we're thinking about sort of the new frontier of searching for a job and communicating about what you're good at, we think certifications play a really important role in that because they can help signal what you're good at to employers in a way that's like legible to them. But we don't want to stop with AI literacy. We think that concept can apply to a number of different things. And if you're actually working with the system, and as we've talked about sort of as in this real-time assessment, it shouldn't just stop with your ability to use AI skills in the workplace, but we should be able to generalize that to all types of different learning. So I definitely don't have an answer, but it's something that's within the ambitions, is not to necessarily stop at, can you use AI at work, but what are all the sort of the wide range of skills that you have on offer? What's a way that we can assess all of those skills and then communicate those clearly?
And when we think about the larger systems, whether it's K-12 or higher ed, how do these assessment systems continue to evolve as well?
I mean, I think one key aspect here, thinking about this lifelong learning trajectory, is really making assessments useful for the individual. Most assessments, you get a score, you get a certification, you get something that communicates externally, and it's not necessarily helping you grow and develop. So how do we think about tailoring score reports, providing more extended descriptions of your performance within an assessment setting or even in a learning setting in ways that give specific feedback to the individual that supports them in, furthering their strengths that they already have, as well as pointing out areas that they can continue to grow and develop, and pointing them toward resources that will actually help them achieve those goals. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, using AI to really support that kind of personalization of feedback and really route people to all the many like open educational resources, academic programs, what have you, to really help them understand how they can improve their skill sets.
Thank you. So what does responsible assessment mean when we are considering equity and access? And I appreciate so much that we've heard a lot of personalization today. We've talked about humanity today. But what does responsible assessment mean in that context?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a similar answer. So doing right by the individual, right? Trying to serve them, to meet their needs, rather than the needs of the system, which, maybe you want to meet too, but really trying to think about, humanizing assessment in ways that can support individuals in growing and in developing. I think that is one aspect. Another aspect of responsible assessment is, as we start to infuse these tools into our development processes, doing so responsibly, right? Making sure that we always have a human in the loop that is verifying that things are done appropriately with a good degree of technical quality, that, we're going to try to minimize harm and maximize the value of any given assessment.
I would add, as we build assessments and systems, diverse and representative stakeholders who are involved in the process. I recall so many things about, say, like the SAT or other standardized tests where the vocabulary really privileges sort of an upper class, white coastal lifestyle with terms like regatta in there, and assesses your verbal comprehension on the basis of knowing obscure terms like that. And so I think we've progressed a bit from there, but recognizing and celebrating that there's amazing brilliance that exists in so many communities that may not always appear in assessments. And our best tool is to open the participation and in the framing, and to be inquisitive, and then to co-develop that, so that way it can surface what resources, assets, and potential areas of even more growth could be, and not assuming that it is a singular path.
Yeah, I can just share an example of how critically important some of the early partners in OpenAI Certified have been around this like diverse stakeholder set. I mean, ETS obviously, but one of our current launch partners, sort of our anchor partner, is Walmart. And the diversity of types of roles at Walmart, the complexity of deploying something to a workforce of that size, the requirement of a frontline worker compared to a salaried worker compared to an hourly worker. It's one example and sort of one slice or vector of diversity, but I think for us to learn from employer partners like John Deere, like Walmart, like Elevance, some of these large organizations who operate in such different contexts than we do, has been really transformative for us in terms of just what are the basics, what are the technological gaps to actually making this widely accessible and easy for someone to use. So we are working on some of those technical gaps as well, but I think just having an early set of stakeholders that are outside of our four walls and really listening to them and understanding their needs has been so important for us.
Yeah, if I can just build on that, I think the co-design element and talking to your end user is so important. This type of user research is something that is near and dear to my heart. Like, there's nothing better than actually putting your assessment in front of kids and watching how they interact with it. Like, that is the best thing, because you really learn what falls apart and what's working well. And so really working with the communities that you're trying to serve and bringing them into the process and sharing that power as much as possible is essential, especially if you want to have any claims to being culturally responsive and responsible.
I appreciate so much that we're talking about empowerment for our learners, and you all are doing your parts in your organizations to make sure that that is guaranteed. So I just want to personally say thank you for that. So as we're starting to get towards the end, just a few more questions for you as you're thinking about some takeaways. So for our education leaders who are listening today, what are some of the actions that they can take to better prepare our learners for the AI era? What should they be? Whoever would like to jump in, not all at once.
Invest. Put some of the money behind the efforts. I've talked with various organizations, or I said we really need some more assessments to help us develop on AI literacy, and they say we agree. When you have one that's valid, and it's like that costs a lot of money, time, and effort in there, and so we need some of those basic investments to proceed. And I think that's especially alarming right now because there's been a lot of withdrawal on that front, and I think that we want to say put in the investment. If this is truly important, if this is really where you see the future is going, then let's start really committing our resources to making it work and acknowledging some of the difficulty that requires that time, that labor, and that initial investment.
Yeah, not just investment, which I totally agree with, but also collaboration, right? This is a cross-sector problem. Academia is not going to solve it. ETS is not going to solve it by ourselves. We have to work with all of you to do right by individuals. And so, let's collaborate and get some investment together.
I think thinking about education leaders, and I'm taking my OpenAI hat on and putting my LDT hat back on. But we talk a lot about the capability overhang, which is basically like the models are so performant at this point that the biggest overhang in getting the most out of them is actually our ability to use them, not whether the models themselves will get better. And so not to be overly reductive, but I think it's way less about staying up to date and reading every headline at this point, which is overwhelming to be sure. It's actually about just creating protected space. So some of the best enterprises that we work with just have a regular practice of saying there's protected time in the day for you to get hands-on with these tools and just have some time to think through this. I think things are happening so fast. I don't spend time in the classroom like I used to, but I can imagine there is a similar analog there of just some protected time and space, not to feel like you need to stay up to date on the most cutting edge piece. I think that might have been the case a year ago or 2 years ago. Now it's just you have the protected time and space to bring this into your own context and practice. Just have the time to consistently practice with the tool.
So we're going to invest and we need to collaborate and make sure we're protecting time and space. So with all of that in mind, what gives you the most optimism about this future that we're discussing today? Oh, there's got to be optimism. We need it.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I am optimistic. I do think things are moving really fast, but I think there is a lot of excitement. I think it's energizing that things are moving fast. It's the reason that we're having this conversation all today, right? And so let's seize that enthusiasm and ride the wave, so to speak, right? It's let's take that excitement and let's actually turn it into reasoned action and make progress. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do really cool things. So let's talk and make things happen.
I would say this room makes me excited because look at this panel. We have academia, we have nonprofit, we have industry, and we have people who have just been really engaged in the conversation, which says we want to have the conversation. We have these same concerns too, and that we're not going to just sit idly by on that, but we're going to gather and try to put our heads together. And so, just trying to stay present in a time where everything's pulling us in so many directions. The ability for us to convene and converse and potentially start interesting new things in a space, this being ground zero, I think is exciting. That gives me hope.
Yeah, I feel the same. I was reflecting on this question this morning and I was like, just the fact we're having this conversation makes me so excited. And anytime I hear when Victor says something like it's the next iteration, it's not something brand new. The fact that we're bringing the full weight of what we understand as a community to bear on these new problems, and that we're using the tools that we've developed, but having pragmatic conversations about how they need to adapt, that gives me so much optimism and hope. So just even being here.
Well, I thank all of you for those responses. I'm definitely optimistic. I have a 3-year-old son, so all of these questions are really personal for me, and I know for many of you in the room. So if we could please give our panelists a round of applause.